I used to think that gameplay was better in World of Warcraft and that storytelling was better in Final Fantasy. After playing both extensively, I think each excel at their respective gameplay and narratives, but due to the design, they're going to cater to different people. So let's talk a little bit about the story delivery of each. Instead of comparing what the story is about, I'm going to focus on the delivery of the story because I feel like that's far more important. Alright, so Final Fantasy performs storytelling in a very direct way. They provide you with the story through a plethora of cutscenes and occasional in-game dialogue. Sometimes these cutscenes are delivered back to back, having you sit back and enjoy a movie split up into parts, essentially. As an example, there have been times where I don't play the game for like 30 minutes or more because I'm just in cutscenes. There's also very little mystery to Final Fantasy in the sense that you know exactly what is happening all the time. The player doesn't have to dig up into the game or look further to understand the main plot. Even side quests will deliver all the information. This can be a good thing and a bad thing because there's very little mystery and research put on the player. That's not to say that the story doesn't have mystery and plot twists in it. What I mean is you won't ever have to wonder what is happening in the moment with the story because Final Fantasy will provide you with the latest part of the story as you're progressing through it, so you're never really wondering. Of course, there are going to be parts with little cliffhangers that will have you itching to know the next part. That's a given. I went to a Star Wars convention once and the writers explained that the best movies and stories are told in a way where not everything is explained fully, instead leaving some ambiguity in certain aspects which causes the person absorbing the story to get their interest piqued. On the flip side of this, players that care more about combat instead of storytelling do not have the option to skip freely most of the time. You can skip by purchasing the level boost and story skip in the Mog Station, and you can skip some cutscenes, but be warned you will always be stuck seeing the main story in your daily roulette. There is no skipping this, and I'd argue that this bothers even the players that really love the story. Now let's talk about World of Warcraft. Let's be real, there's players out there that don't know the story in World of Warcraft because WoW makes it very optional. This doesn't mean that the story isn't extremely compelling and well written. I'd argue that the story is just as good as Final Fantasy, if not better. In fact, I'd argue that there are just as many characters in WoW that have great character arcs and are interesting to see develop, sometimes even to their end. In contrast to Final Fantasy, WoW delivers shorter cutscenes and dialogue to the main story in small nuggets. It provides the player with enough information to have an understanding of what's going on, but doesn't provide every detail of what's going on. If you want to learn more about the story, you'll need to read the quests in between the cutscenes and sometimes even dive into the optional quests or secrets in the game. WoW delivers their story in a way that's very optional to the player, which caters to those who care more about the gameplay. If you want to do your dailies, you won't be forced to sit through cutscenes in the process. Even when it comes to a new player jumping into the game, Final Fantasy will have you progress through the entire story before banding up with players in the latest content, or you can pay to skip it. In World of Warcraft, you simply level up and go to the content. You don't have to go through the entire history of the story if you don't want to. Shifting gears to something that can enhance the gameplay or the story is the music. World of Warcraft uses ambient and orchestrated music to draw you into the world. The music direction reminds me of themes I'd hear in Star Wars or in like Lord of the Rings. Final Fantasy uses music with lyrics to amp up the mood of combat in situations like trials. A lot of these songs will feel similar to anime style intros that can be a literal music video. It's two different styles, and Final Fantasy certainly pumps it up when it comes to the music in the game. Getting into a trial fight feels like you're beginning an epic battle each time. While there's nothing like this in WoW, there's plenty of atmospheric music that makes the environment always feel alive. Just don't expect to get that sudden hit of dopamine when you're entering an epic boss fight in World of Warcraft. Another huge difference between the two games is the direction of classes and characters. On Final Fantasy, you pick one character and you design that character and you basically grow up all the way and level up all the various classes with that specific character. In World of Warcraft, you pick multiple characters and level them up depending on the class that you actually want to play. So you end up having several characters with different classes, and you don't really get attached to one single character the way you do in Final Fantasy, which is not necessarily a bad thing. You just become an altaholic in World of Warcraft, as they call it. Classes in Final Fantasy also feel pretty linear. They have a set of abilities and roles that every player will have. There's no differences here, meaning if you and I both created a paladin today, we would have the same exact abilities and roles to play. We would both play a tank. We would both have the same abilities to press. There isn't a different variation of paladin for each of us to be. In World of Warcraft, it's almost a complete opposite. You create one character per class. Each class has a variation in the form of talent trees, but goes even further by providing different roles to some classes. As an example, as a paladin in WoW, you can be either a healer, a tank, or even DPS. And even if we're both playing the same roles, it's not 100% that we'll have the same talents. You could be a PvP player and I could be a PvE player, making our compositions totally different. Because WoW takes a different approach to your created character, you'll likely level multiple different races or stick to one race and even reuse your character model for another character. Both have great appeal, but will ultimately come down to whatever your preference is. Okay, we're getting into the gameplay and graphics part of the comparison, and I know I might say some things that are going to piss you off or piss off some people right here, and that's okay because it's my honest opinion based on actual facts. So yeah. Final Fantasy XIV employs a realistic and detailed art style with anime influences, emphasizing immersive high fantasy environments and refined character designs. On the other hand, World of Warcraft features a bold, stylized art style and exaggerated proportions and vivid, saturated colors, creating a whimsical and distinctive visual identity. While Final Fantasy XIV leads towards a serious and epic atmosphere, World of Warcraft adopts a lighthearted and adventurous tone. My biggest gripe is that Final Fantasy feels very undersaturated and requires mods to help bring the graphical fidelity to where I think it should be. In fact, there are a lot of players that use reshade to enhance the visuals, and a lot of popular players on YouTube and Twitch kind of speak to it in their videos. The thing is, I think Final Fantasy should simply have a saturated slider to enhance the color. It should be built in. There's no reason to have to get a mod, and I think it would be simpler to add it to the game and would certainly cater to everyone playing the game. I don't think there's one player that would be upset because you add more color to the game natively. That said, both games had their graphics updated because they needed it. World of Warcraft does a brilliant job of making their world feel large and huge to scale. If you want to travel, you do have the option to teleport, but not to every location within yards of where you need to be unless you're a mage. You'll have your teleport options on a decent cooldown. Final Fantasy, on the other hand, has a more constant tone. Environments are just as diverse as World of Warcraft, but there are no locations that feel grimy and gross. Every location is styled and nice, and you're able to teleport to just about anywhere you need to be with only a short amount of travel time with your mount or by walking. The environments change, but they always give you that same sense of adventure you're on. Kind of like Mario games where the tone is the same throughout the world, even though the environment kind of changes. Okay, so we touched on combat a bit earlier, but to elaborate on this more, Final Fantasy to me appears to have a slight like 0.001 second delay in combat. Maybe I'm going crazy, but I definitely feel it compared to the other games. In World of Warcraft, the actions feel quicker and more responsive. Final Fantasy offers a lot of flash to your abilities. This is a good thing, but also I think it can be a bad thing. The good thing is that you feel you're performing some amazing moves when your character is in combat. The bad thing is that when there's multiple players, it looks like color and light regurgitation. I think some players will limit their combat animation of others because it gets pretty intense. World of Warcraft has a simpler, less extravagant animation system. I mean, just compare Paladin in Final Fantasy to Paladin in World of Warcraft. I think this is all I need to show. But really, WoW's combat is super fluid and feels good when you're playing it. If I could make it flashier, I probably wouldn't, but maybe some animations could use an update. If you're into PvP, know that it's nearly non-existent in Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy focuses on its PvE heavily and does a great job of it, and some players looking for a healthy dose of PvP mixed in, well, you'll find a little bit, but really there's no community for it, to be honest. There is zero world PvP and no options to turn it on if you want. World of Warcraft does have that flexibility. If you want to PvP in the world, turn it on. And if you don't, you just turn it off. Factions and allegiances are also different. In Final Fantasy, it's based on the city you want to represent. You'll wave your flag and fight for that group in formal PvP. In World of Warcraft, you'll fight for your faction, which is comprised of the races from that continent homeland. However, in formal PvP, you might group up with your natural enemy to beat the other team. So the better game is, well, it really just comes down to whatever your preferences are, really. There's not really one that I feel is like way better than the other. I think if you pick either of these two games, you're picking a really great MMORPG. I kind of grew up on Final Fantasy, to be honest, and before I played these two games, I played Final Fantasy XI online. But if I'm strictly comparing Final Fantasy XIV to World of Warcraft, my preference is World of Warcraft because it's more diverse, it caters to PvP and PvE, and gives me more flexibility with the story and things that I really care about when I'm playing, and just the overall experience for me is better on World of Warcraft based on my preferences. But what about you? What do you prefer? Leave your opinions in the comments down below. I'd love to read them. And don't forget, it's totally free to support the channel just by subscribing because it doesn't cost you anything. Or you can come chat with me on Twitch anytime. We can talk about Final Fantasy or World of Warcraft or really any video game. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.